On November 22, 1963, the most powerful man in the world was killed in broad daylight, right in front of hundreds of witnesses, on a street literally lined with cameras. And somehow, welcome to this explainer by the way, somehow, 60 years later we still don't fully know who did it. Let's dive into the most consequential unresolved mystery in American history.
Now, you might hear that and think, okay, here comes a wild internet conspiracy theory. But no, that is the official, on-the-record position of the United States Congress. Let that sink in for a second. So how on earth did we get here? How does a modern superpower just lose the narrative of its own president's public assassination? Today, we're going to break down the official record, what was completely ignored, and what this whole thing has cost us.
To understand how the narrative unraveled, we have to start at the very beginning. Section 1. 10 seconds in Dallas, a nation shattered.
Dallas that morning felt absolutely electric. Kennedy was popular, handsome, young, the kind of president Americans really wanted to believe in. The crowds lining Dealey Plaza were cheering, Jackie was in pink, the Texas sun was shining, and then, in less than 10 seconds, everything America thought it knew about itself just shattered. The shots came incredibly fast. Kennedy was hit in the neck, then the head. Governor Connally, sitting right in front of him, was also wounded. The limousine sped toward Parkland Memorial Hospital, but honestly, it was already over. At 1 p.m., John F. Kennedy was pronounced dead. But look at how impossibly compressed this timeline is. Mere hours later, authorities arrest their seemingly perfect suspect, 24-year-old former Marine Lee Harvey Oswald. A guy who had actually renounced his American citizenship, moved to the Soviet Union, and then came back and somehow ended up working right along the motorcade route. It looked clean, almost too clean. He claimed he was a patsy being set up, but he never got a trial because just 48 hours later, a nightclub owner named Jack Ruby stepped right out of a crowd and shot Oswald dead. The one man who could answer our questions was gone forever.
And that brings us to Section 2, the institutional rush, closing the book. Here's where things get really uncomfortable. The investigative machinery immediately went to work, but not necessarily to find the truth. They wanted to definitively close the case before a real investigation even got off the ground. Check out this chilling quote from FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover, sent out in a memo the very next day. The American public must be satisfied that Oswald acted alone, with no co-conspirators. Wow. The decision was made before the evidence was even fully gathered. Hoover decided Oswald absolutely did it. Alone. Not probably, absolutely. And phone recordings from that exact period revealed that Hoover and newly sworn-in President Lyndon Johnson, they weren't interested in a thorough investigation at all. In fact, LBJ privately called the prospect of a deeper inquiry a three-ring circus.
So LBJ created the Warren Commission, mainly to give the investigation the appearance of credibility. But look at the actual constraints here. They were given just 10 months to work, relying almost entirely on evidence fed to them by Hoover's FBI. You know, the same FBI that already decided the answer before the question was asked. But the most glaring, absolutely mind-boggling conflict of interest was the inclusion of Allen Dulles. Dulles was the former CIA director, the exact same man President Kennedy had fired after the disastrous Bay of Pigs invasion. That man was now helping to investigate Kennedy's murder. It's just a massive conflict of interest built right into the foundation of the official record.
Which leads perfectly into Section 3, the physical inconsistencies defying physics. To avoid the conclusion of a conspiracy, the Warren Commission had to rely on a version of events that quite literally defies physics. And it all comes down to the number 3. Investigators only found 3 shell casings on the 6th floor of the book depository. This severely limited the entire narrative, because obviously if you have 3 casings, you can only have 3 bullets.
But contrast those 3 casings with the actual physical damage. 7. There were 7 separate wounds inflicted on President Kennedy and Governor Connally combined. So you have 3 bullets, right? Well, 1 missed the car entirely, another was the fatal headshot. That leaves exactly 1 bullet to cause the remaining 7 wounds. Mathematically, it is literally impossible to explain this with a lone gunman unless you get, well, incredibly creative. And to make the math work, the commission got really creative. They invented the infamous single bullet theory. Let's map out the sheer absurdity of this step by step. They claimed 1 single bullet entered Kennedy's back, exited his throat, paused in midair, hit Connally's back, tore through his rib, exited his chest, shattered his wrist bone, and finally lodged itself in his thigh. 7 wounds, 1 bullet. And when investigators recovered it, that bullet looked remarkably pristine,
barely deformed at all, despite allegedly passing through 2 human bodies and fragmenting solid bone. Why invent this magical trajectory? Because if you need a 4th bullet, you need a second shooter, and a second shooter means a conspiracy.
The commission didn't just stretch physics, though, they actively ignored witnesses. The official record firmly states the shot came from the building behind Kennedy, but that completely ignored the actual surgeons who treated him at Parkland Hospital. They reported that the wound in his neck appeared to come from the front. That testimony completely contradicted the whole story, so it was just quietly set aside. It gets worse. An FBI agent later testified under oath that he was ordered by his superiors to destroy a letter Oswald had written to the FBI. And guess what? It was only destroyed after Oswald was killed and couldn't be questioned anymore.
Which brings us to the big why. Section 4, the Cold War Calculus, Managing the Panic.
Now you're probably asking, why? Why cover this up? Well, you really have to understand the terrifying world this was happening in. This was 1963. The Cold War was real. The threat of nuclear annihilation was an everyday reality. Both sides had weapons ready to launch. If it suddenly came out that the Soviet Union or Cuba was behind the assassination of an American president, the public would have panicked. Full-scale nuclear war was a genuine possibility. Plus, the CIA was currently running top-secret operations to assassinate Fidel Castro, operations they absolutely could not afford a serious, sweeping investigation to expose.
So, officials at the highest levels made a grim, calculated choice. Keep the country calm, keep the secrets buried, put one man at the center of the story, close the book, and move on. They essentially sacrificed a thorough investigation for the sake of national and potentially global stability.
But you can't bury everything forever. Section 5, the unraveling narrative, a fractured record.
A narrative built on ignored evidence just cannot hold forever. Even the men who built the official story began to doubt it. Governor Connolly went to his grave insisting one bullet did not hit both him and the president, and LBJ himself privately admitted years later that he believed it was a conspiracy. You can see how the public record fractured over time. In 1964, the Warren Commission definitively concludes Oswald acted alone. But then, fast forward to 1975, a bystander's home movie, the Zapruder film, airs on national television. The public finally sees the brutal, undeniable moment for themselves. The government's carefully managed timeline shatters, forcing Congress to open an entirely new investigation in the late 1970s.
And why did they have to reopen it? Because millions of Americans sat in their living rooms, watched that footage, and asked one chilling, undeniable question. If the shot came from the building behind him, why did his head go back? That one visual poured gasoline on a public trust that was already heavily damaged by Vietnam and Watergate.
Just look at the stark contrast between these two official government conclusions. In 1964, the Warren Commission insisted Oswald acted alone. But by the late 1970s, after reviewing withheld evidence from the FBI and CIA, a congressional committee concluded there was a high probability of 2 gunmen and a probable conspiracy. The original FBI-driven narrative completely collapsed under their scrutiny.
And that brings us to our final part, Section 6, the cost of secrecy, the modern legacy.
We really need to talk about the lingering damage here. We are now more than 60 years removed from that electric day in Dallas. 60 years, and yet thousands of documents related to the assassination remain classified. They are heavily redacted. They are hidden from you, the public. Decades after the fact, the government continues to decide that its citizens simply cannot be trusted with the full historical record.
And there is an ultimate, heavy cost to all of this. Because when governments hide things, people fill that silence with whatever makes sense to them. The institutional habit of managing the narrative, of deciding what you are allowed to handle, permanently destroys public trust. Every single redaction and sealed file just feeds the exact suspicion the government claims it wants to erase.
So, I'll leave you with this provocative thought as we wrap up this explainer. If the government is still classifying documents about an event from 1963, what exactly are they still protecting? And perhaps more importantly, who gets to decide what you are allowed to know? Thank you for joining us, and let that question sit with you for a while.